Okay, so we're coming to the end of the MOS factions that I can actually look at, and this next one I've actually been putting off for a little bit because there's not actually much that I can talk about with regards to them for reasons that will become obvious when I showcase their units, and that is the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. Now, I will probably do Eriador next after this one, and there is some more to talk about with regards to them, so it's not all doom and gloom, but the Orcs of the Misty Mountains are not the most... well, they're not the best example of a faction to use when looking at changes between MOS and vanilla, that's for sure. But we'll load in their units and we'll have a look at them regardless, because I'm not going to leave one faction out just for the sake of it. So, why have I been putting the Orcs of the Misty Mountains off? Well, the main reason for that is they don't really have anything... well, they do have a few things that are new, but it's not anything that is unique to them. And they've even had one pretty large thing taken away from them, but we'll get back to that towards the end because it's more relevant there. But we'll start off with this end, and of course they still have their low tier goblins. This was always part of the orc mentality in vanilla and now, where you have a lot of trash that you just sort of overwhelm your enemy with, and with the Orcs of the Misty Mountains you have no choice but to use it, because all of your units, you do have a kind of wide variety of units, but in terms of infantry, you only have 5 melee infantry units, and this is one of them. They're going to get slaughtered by elite infantry, but nonetheless this is one of the things you're going to have to deal with, and this is a problem because the balancing on online is, as I've said before, rather skewed. So something like a faction like Arnor is going to be able to field infantry at the same sort of cost as these guys that is far, far better. So that's a bit of a problem, but you know, they are a low tier orc unit, you know exactly what to expect from this sort of unit. Pretty dreadful all round. They aren't even as good in my opinion as the Goblin Band, because at least the Goblin Band have spears and can trap cavalry in sustained melee, whereas these guys don't have that advantage. Slightly more survivable in sustained melee, perhaps they'll do a bit more damage, but the spears, in my opinion, are a little bit better. The heavy goblin halberds, now these guys can form spear wall, of course. They are pretty much the same unit they always were, only with more in their unit. They now have an extra 50, just like the orc halberdiers, but they are now basically the same unit as the orc halberdiers because they got the ability to form spear wall as well, which they always should have had, to be honest. I do kind of like the ratty look of the orc, well, the heavy goblin armors, of course. This isn't really a faction of orcs, so to speak. There's more goblin units than orc units in the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, but nonetheless, some of the halberds look pretty mean as well, but you're going to be relying heavily on these guys if you ever lose your mind enough to play the Orcs of the Misty Mountains in an online game. But yeah, this is really one of the few units in their faction which I think is genuinely pretty decent if you use it correctly, but of course it can be outperformed by most other halberd units, as with most orc units as a whole. We have the heavy goblin infantry. Now these guys, I think that overall these guys aren't as good as they once were, mainly because the gap between them and the more elite units has grown pretty significantly. So for example, stuff like Dismounted Dunedain Knights in vanilla, these guys would do a half decent job of at least causing them some damage, whereas now in MOS it's much more difficult to do that. They're more numerous, so you'll be able to outmaneuver them on a battle such as this in an open field. But ultimately, the gap in quality has grown to the point where these guys aren't particularly great. They're good middle tier, sort of cannon fodder-esque sort of infantry as they always were, but again, in online, you're not really going to be seeing these guys do all that well. Hopefully the balancing will be sorted out in Reforged, because the Misty Mountains Orcs are now easily the weakest faction in MOS when you're doing online, because at least Gundabad have got some strange sort of units like the Barrow Wights and their wide variety of trolls, and some of their new Rudour units in particular have buffed that faction pretty significantly. The Orc Bodyguards are a unit which are shared with Gundabad, and they are actually a pretty good unit. They're like, if all of the men in the heavy goblin infantry units were as good as the Orc Bodyguards, I would say that they were a unit which were pretty decent. But as it is, this is the Bodyguard, so you're only really going to be having one of them, and they do only have 100. So it's worth saying that they actually have less in a unit than something like Dismounted Dunedain Knights. So you're in a bit of a pickle if you just bring these guys, which is a bit of a shame. And you have a basic spear unit, the Hillman. This is a unit which is shared with Gundabad. They are, of course, they have the Rudour type look to them. But again, like, none of the good Rudour units are here in the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. So Not great for them, not great. The low tier spears are appreciated, but there's no high tier units to back them up. And now we have a rather wide variety of trash skirmishers. Starting off with the Schneider Archers, we've seen them before. They're worthless in MOS because their missile damage is almost non-existent. You can just walk through a hail of their arrows all day long. Worthless. Wouldn't ever get them. Maybe in campaign if I had no choice at the start, but other than that, not at all. Goblin Archers again, basically just very, very slightly better. You know, still I would say not worth it. They can at least put down stakes, which is nice. These guys can do flaming shot. These guys cannot, but the stakes still pretty nice. The heavy Goblin Archers, these guys were always a bit underpowered in vanilla because they were outmatched so easily by most other skirmishers, and they didn't have an advantage in terms of numbers. They do now have a numbers advantage, but their missile damage is woeful. They also can now put down stakes, but it's not enough to make up for the Archer nerf, to be honest with you. The Orc factions are never going to be fantastic when you put them in a skirmish fight against one of the good factions, for example. The only one in vanilla really was Rohan that they could really go toe-to-toe with, and that was more a question of volume and quality. So yeah, the heavy Goblin Archers, they are armoured at least, but that's the only nice thing I can say about them. The Archers nerf across the board has meant that the Orc faction's Archers have gotten next to useless, which you could say is right, because that's what the Orcs should be about, but the balancing of the game has suffered a little bit from that. We of course have the Snagger Skirmishes. Now the Javelins do slightly more damage, but they don't do as much damage as most other Javelins, and they are very easily defeated by enemy Archers, because of course they're not the most heavily armoured. And of course if you get them into melee, Snagger will fall apart, so it's not brilliant overall. We have the Wolves. The Wolves are essentially a very high attack but very low defense unit. They're one of the few units in the mod which has terrible defense. They'll die off very quickly, but they will do a decent amount of damage at least. But ultimately I would say Wolves are kind of an odd unit. I mean, yeah, they're a thing. They're new, but ultimately I would say that their complete lack of defense is a real problem. One of the few shining lights of the Misty Mountains Orcs are their trolls. The cave trolls are not as good as something like the Olakai, of course, or Gundabad's wider variety of trolls, but they will still do a ton of damage. Trolls are always a pain to deal with, especially if you're a faction that doesn't have pikes, so trolls are an excellent tool to use against the elves, for example, but, you know, the trolls, pretty much the same as they always were. Very deadly. Dopey expressions on the cave trolls. The Warg Riders have actually gotten a buff, and this is actually a fairly useful unit to use now, but unfortunately the backup they receive from their main army is not really sufficient to make them good. Gundabad can use their Wargs pretty well now, but I would say that the Misty Mountains Orcs Wargs will suffer from arrow fire, and ultimately enemy infantry are going to win any infantry engagement with the Misty Mountains, and you're not going to be able to turn around a battle with a unit of defeated Wargs, I fear. And then we have the Rudaur Scouts, which are essentially just a more traditional cavalry unit, but they are still very low tier. These wooden shields and jerkins are not going to be able to defend them against crossbow bolts and elven arrows, I don't think. So, there is one big absence from the Misty Mountains roster, I should say, and that is a literally big absence, because it is, of course, the Balrog. Now, you would never see the Balrog online for two reasons. One, he was horrendously overpowered, and two, he would almost certainly crash the game. But to take away the Balrog, which was really the thing which, every time you opened up the Misty Mountains Orcs roster and you saw him there, you think, yeah, you know, this is a roster that does at least have some teeth when you get into the engine room of the faction. The Balrog was always... Okay, so I was just talking about the game crashing under the duress of the Balrog being on the field, and the game crashed. So, you know, hooray for stability. But as I was saying, it is a shame that the Balrog isn't there, because you always got the sense that the Misty Mountains Orcs could be powerful if they fielded him. And he was fun to use on occasion if you wanted to do a little private game, but alas, he isn't there anymore, and that means the Misty Mountains have lost their real heavy hitter in exchange for, honestly, not a lot. And that's really the problem. The Misty Mountains Orcs have not changed at all, and they have been hit pretty hard with the nerfs and balance changes that MOS has introduced. So next time we will be taking a look at Eriador, and hopefully it won't crash halfway through me explaining their units again. And then after that, the only one left to do is Mordor, and then we will be done with the MOS factions, and we can start looking ahead to Reforged, which I'm really looking forward to. And I hope to see you for the next video.